Morning, once again, the Talk Shop from Studio 255 in the Laramie Plains Civic Center. This segment brought to you by Range Community Insurance and Pole Mountain Pharmacy, dedicated to the health and wellness of Southeast Wyoming from their location at 4th and Harney. We bring you today Anne Brande, Executive Director for the Albany County Conservancy. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Glad to have you here this morning.
On this snow dusty day.
Yeah, very good, very good. If you haven't opened your eyes to the Gem City today, there's a little skiff of Mother Nature's snowflakes.
Yeah, we need a lot more skiffs to
we
come
need
up
more
with that
skiffs,
10
or we're not going to have running water, right?
We're down 10 feet.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Well, in topics of conservancy, Albany County Conservancy, what highlights do you have for us today on the Talk Shop?
Well, so the Conservancy's been really busy since the last time I talked to you. Last September, the federal agency in charge of the historic mitigation for the Rail Tie Wind project decided that they'd had enough of even trying to hold historic mitigation meetings. They're the ones who stalled for 5 years because they didn't want any of the consultants they brought in to reach any kind of consensus, because that's to their benefit. Typically, if you have energy project or industrial project by historic sites, you have to mitigate them. But if you can't get...
That's part of due process.
Right, but if you don't allow people to talk, experts like archaeologists, then you don't have to pay, obviously. So they decided to hush everything up and nudge. So the final place that gets resolved is the State Historic Preservation Officer, because it's a state agency, so they check that final federal box. And so in Wyoming now, it's okay to mitigate a National Historic Landmark in a separate county. No, it's not.
That's not in... They don't even have standing in the same county?
Right, so how did this come about? They decided to pull a figure, a monetary amount out of the sky, $350,000. That is grossly insufficient. And to put that in perspective, the James River, so those of you who, are as old as I am, you might remember studying about Jamestown. The James River had a pristine view. You could stand at a certain point in the James River and see exactly what you saw when you were a pilgrim. And they put up an electric power line, and they shouldn't have, right? The Army Corps of Engineers was supposed to check the federal box, and so they at least mitigated. I think they paid $1 million or $5 million, right? Just to tip off Wyoming where you ought to be on this kind of thing, right? So with Ames, this Spanish company that now is pushing Rail Tie Wind decided that they would just propose $350,000. People have been talking. My organization wanted to put a migrations museum on Highway 287 at Tie Siding because that's where the Overland Trail and the Cherokee Trail merge. And there are 480 historic sites in the area of rail tie, to let you know why this is of issue. Everything from indigenous burial sites to buffalo hunting grounds to the Ames National Historic Landmark, which many locals call the Ames Monument, which is a granite pyramid that was excavated on site at the highest point of any transportation corridor in the United States. It was at the highest point of the Transcontinental Railroad. Right at the historic town of Sherman, there's another site. There's the historic town of Tie Siding. There's a lot of stuff out there. Ben Holiday used to come through there. Jim Bridger used to come through there. Everything from prehistory, because the most significant prehistory site in the state, in my opinion, newly excavated in 2022, so you may not have heard of it, is the Willow Springs site. And Spencer Pelton, our state archaeologist, excavated that. And that site's of real notoriety because they found pottery. You don't find pottery in Wyoming. Our climate is too harsh to find prehistory pottery. And they found pottery, they sent it off to New Mexico, right? It predates the Anasazi. Very rare stuff. And 5,000 feet from a wind turbine. Maybe we need to move that wind turbine. But they had only, in their programmatic agreement, getting to how you have to follow all of this legality stuff.
Is the biggest problem a lack of awareness in preservation?
No, these energy companies are pretty skilled at manipulation, aren't they? And if they aren't skilled, they hire people within the industry who are. And I am really tired of hearing that renewable energy is going to solve everything, because these people are oil and gas companies that have shifted because you need to follow the money. And they've also known that, well, oil and gas-wise, they have to play the game right, because people will litigate, people will watch them. They can pull this stuff with wind, right? So they decided...
Is wind a distraction, then, for their real purpose?
They just want money, right? Construction's construction. So, and we paid them a lot of money during the Biden administration. You know, heavily subsidized wind and solar is. Everybody knows that. Everybody talks about that in Wyoming. But so what happened?
Is it true that the windmills around Medicine Bow, for instance, Medicine Bow, Wyoming area?
There's a lot of cultural sites there. You know, for those of you who don't know, Bone Wars. So we're talking about dinosaur bones. We're talking about a place called Como Bluff. And I mention that word now, and I see people in their 30s or people from other parts of the country who look confused. You know, dinosaurs.
New York City museums with the largest dinosaur.
Yeah, T-Rex, you know, if you ever took your
displays, not displayed in Wyoming, but extracted from Wyoming.
All over the world.
And all over the world now.
Yeah, so, and that is where...
At a time where we were essentially raped. We weren't compensated in the way that we would be.
No, we didn't know any better, but we're still being raped. And that's what people, so I get two responses that I completely disagree with, and I encourage you all, if you care about Wyoming, to don't buy into this and use your brains. You know, while you drink your coffee and you're reading news on your phone, think about this a little bit. But, you know, at first people tell me, oh, that's big money. You can't fight that. No, we have laws. You can fight that. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds, because we're fast-tracking the laws that we have, right? But we still have them. They didn't disappear yesterday. They're still in some shape or form. So are we going to be smart enough that we can use that law? That's the National Environmental Policy Act. You know, where's public outrage? Second thing is that, because I don't agree with that, you know, there's a lot of money. So what? So what if there's a lot of money? I have a voice.
Once the money's been paid, you lose that.
I have a voice. I have intellect. I can understand the process, and my members have voices, right? And then the second thing is that then they just want to point out that, well, you know, the Green Deal is just something you can't fight. I don't agree with that. Energy's energy. Nothing's green. Nothing. I mean, that's like you thinking that the plastic with the triangle on the bottle is going to wind up recycled tomorrow.
What do you think? What do you think of labels, Anne? What do you think of labels?
They don't work real well in Wyoming. They don't work well here
green,
because
freedom.
That's marketing. That's marketing. Think about it. We want to dumb everything down to a simple sound bite, especially now when people don't theoretically have an attention span. People need to get an attention span. Don't hand over your resources. If you like to hunt,
what's your freedom
fish,
worth,
hike.
What's your freedom worth?
Everything. Everything. And in Wyoming, in case you haven't looked, we have a lot of freedom because, you know, in Wyoming, you can be a big fish in a little pond, right? In another place on the planet, there's just more of us. So your voice gets heard in Wyoming. That's what's really cool about Wyoming. So anyway, what happened is they mitigated the Ames Monument. That's the only thing they focused on because they wouldn't let anybody talk about the other 479 historic sites. So they got that on paper, and so how did they mitigate it? They gave $350,000, very insufficient.
For one of 450 items.
No, it doesn't address the Ames at all. They gave it to the State Museum. I'm pretty sure the State Museum already has Wyoming exhibits. So it's non-discretionary. They just kind of threw it at what they thought our State Historic Preservation
Was that a buyoff
officer
for the state?
would favor.
Was that a buyoff for the state? In
You
your
know,
opinion?
No. I tend to look at people broadly, and our State Historic Preservation Office really put in good communication skills the 4 years that I participated as a consulting party because of the expertise I brought to the conversation. And I had to demand to be a consulting party, which gets to don't hand over, the hen house to the foxes without voicing up. I had to ask to be a consulting party. That process conveniently overlooked the Albany County Conservancy. I think Albany County should talk about an Albany County historic area, right? There was the Albany County Historic Preservation Board, and they worked really hard to talk about mitigation as well. And they were excluded, as was the Conservancy, as were everyone except the state agencies involved. We were excluded. They met in secret to hammer out this mitigation. That's the violation. You can't do that. You can't meet in secret. And then the people who conducted the meeting took notes. And they met multiple times.
And now it's exasperated, this situation of doing things that they're unknown. They're choosing to announce things in Carbon County that affect Albany County. Did I get that right? Is that even close?
Well, so a lot of these cool areas 100 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, we didn't have counties, did we? It's just a geographic place. So a lot of this stuff is on the border. So half of it's in Albany and half of it's in Carbon.
Right, okay.
Right? Because that's a really cool place. You're just driving to Medicine Bow. I mean, there's so much history there. So much history. And all of a sudden you're in Carbon County, aren't you? So a lot of these projects sit in both counties. So they involve the Albany County Commissioners and the Carbon County Commissioners. And that gets to, don't just settle for, not knowing what's going on. Talk to your Albany County Commissioners. Talk to your Carbon County Commissioners. And I think you're going to be shocked. So in my email 2 weeks ago, I got another wind project. There are 11 north of town owned by Rocky Mountain Power. 11. I'm counting the ones that all impact the same resources, the same wildlife areas, the same historic areas, right? There's TB Flats. Well, first there's Foot Creek. That's Hannah. There's TB Flats 1, 2, and 3. There's Ecola Flats. There's Rock River Wind. There's, and now this is kind of breaching over to that I-25 zone, right? Then there's Glenwood 1 and 2. And there's another project over there. There's Two Rivers Wind, 4 miles north of Medicine Bow.
Who determines saturation or density? Who determines
Nobody. That? It's a free-for-all. Buy some land, register as an LLC with the Secretary of State, even if you're from out of country, right? Because we're like Delaware, right? Sell it off to somebody because it's a good place to put up more wind. Everybody else is making money at wind. Maybe you ought to make money at wind, right? And then try to get some leases going if you can't. And try to run it on private land. Try to go around with a simple contract.
Wind must be a tough business. Come on. I drive I-80 between Laramie and Cheyenne better part of a year, and I see a broken wind turbine blade.
They're not in it,
and they can't repair it.
They're not in it to make money that way. They make money building it.
Oh.
Yeah, they make money building it.
Is it true a million a piece? Is that true or false to your knowledge?
So it can be even more than that, right?
You're kidding.
It depends on supply chain issues and other things. So you're catching on. One turbine would pay for the mitigation of the Ames Monument. And when you have 200 and you're held accountable by law, then maybe you ought to mitigate.
We're worried about revenue in government. The tax, or this, the taxes are that, revenues we're short, we're fearful of having to cut employees, and $1 million wind turbine might do a lot to support more of us. If we're going to have so many windmills, maybe we should have a lot more revenue.
Well, so last Wednesday, I went to the Public Service Commission for the second time. So I went to the Public Service Commission in 2023 because I get Public Service Commission notifications. You can go right to their website and ask for that. And Rock Creek Wind, which goes from I-80 all the way to Wheatland Reservoir 3.
Okay. There
are 3 phases of that wind project. I didn't even count that in my list because I didn't finish my list. There's Rock Creek 1, 2, and 3. So that's what people are talking about the most to me now, because they go out to go fishing or hunting on that public land and they're overwhelmed because they didn't know that was there. And that's how this is happening too, is, I'll tell a lot of people I know from other places in the state, and think about yourself, you may not know the newest thing that went up in Meeteetse. And I'm not talking energy, I'm talking about just something, right? Something that's changed in the community. Because when was the last time you went hiking there? Well, that was last summer. So that's what's happening to Albany and Carbon County, is that people may live in Cheyenne or they may live in Casper. And when was the last time they drove 287 to Laramie? Well, I haven't been to a game, right? So then they see it and they react. That's too late. People need to start to look around them. Take a ride. Take a ride and see what's happening to where you used to hike, where you used to fish. So now they're going to put a pump storage facility by Seminole. Why should you care? It's going to devastate the Miracle Mile. We all know that name, right? If you're a fisherman, we all know the Miracle Mile.
Springtime fishing in Wyoming.
Don't put it there. Why am I mentioning pumped storage? Guess what it's for? Pump storage for what? Wind energy. So don't think those wind turbines just kill eagles. They kill trout, right? It's industrialization is what it is. And so, they gave 2 months public comment, but you have to know where to look. So I'm more focused on what's happening along the 287 corridor. So I'm brushing my teeth. I'm listening to Wyoming Public Radio. I have older folks that I know say, why do you listen to Wyoming Public Radio? Because their theory is even green money trickles to public radio. You know what? I don't think it's that organized, folks. I don't think you can blame a journalist. Even if they do have a specific angle, they don't even know that they present, right? That's human nature, right? When I talk to people, they may think I have a focus.
You're bent.
I'm bent.
You're bent, Brande.
So I think that's just not appropriate. So why do I listen to Wyoming Public Radio? For stuff like this. Whether I think that, I'm a little frustrated with how the coverage goes, I get coverage. So that morning I heard that public comment ended the next day. On that thing, right? So then I did what anybody in overdrive would do, be in overdrive. I don't even fish, folks. It's just, I remember I run a photography business. One of my colleagues was a fish fanatic. He fished all the time. He was always going to the Miracle Mile, a kid who grew up from Torrington, right? That was his piece of heaven. So I started to learn about the Miracle Mile and about the trout and all this stuff. And I was, reaching out to my buddies. Somebody I'd done a portrait for. I just did their little boys' portraits, right? Adorable family. Why? He works at the Laramie Fly Store. He's a member of Trouts Unlimited, right? Don't just sit back and think somebody else has got your back. Because I have news for you in Wyoming. Who's got your back? There aren't a lot of us here.
Do conservancies work together?
Yeah,
Albanycounty
of course.
Conservancy is not the only Wyoming interested body, but you're all kind of disjointed as well. In some ways you work together, but in funding ways, each looks out for their own.
Well, here's the problem with conservancies in Wyoming. Name the homegrown ones. You got 3. Are any of them near me?
Which are in Albany County? Which are looking out for Albany County interests?
You're hearing silence here, right? Nobody. That's why I founded the Conservancy, right? But
when did you found this organization?
2000. It was COVID-19, and I wanted to put up a migrations museum. I had no idea that wind had taken over my county. I was you. When was the last time I saw the stuff at Arlington when I would drive to Rollins? Because we would drive through Rollins a lot because my kids Nordic ski, right? So we're headed to Pinedale, we're headed to Lander. And I think, oh, that's graceful. Oh, that's progressive. Because there was just one project there. Then guess what? Because I have 3 kids. There was more projects. I looked over toward Medicine Bow from I-80 and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of wind turbines. And then, like everybody, I would drive Shirley Basin back and think, that's a shame, especially at night. I hate driving Shirley Basin at night. So horrific, right? Like, I may not be a biologist, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that thing isn't good for birds, bats, eagles, burrowing owls, getting to stuff I read because I love like Autobahn posts about stuff.
What would you say to somebody who said, come on, Ann, wildlife will manage. They will
No, they won't.
They will move.
My answer, I just said this to a friend yesterday, right? Because he's headed to go watch his grandson play baseball in Arizona. And he has a historic property that has the Dale Creek Bridge, coolest place. So, I mean, thousands of Scottish immigrants blasted through sheer granite. Like, on his land, you stand in the middle of that thing and you get it. Like, it's so overwhelmingly cool. And he and I are talking on the phone because of the Conservancy, right? And I laugh, and he's commending me for doing some of the stuff I do. And he says, I'm headed to Arizona. I'm like, come on, I'm not moving anywhere. I'm going to die in Albany County with my boots on, right? And he laughs. And I'm like, my answer to you is, how hard is it to defend what you've got? Because just pick a place on the map. Move to Houston. You going to see much wildlife? Move to Denver. You going to see much healthy wildlife? I mean, I have friends in Denver, and they get an occasional deer. I won't make any comment as to the health of that deer. It's like seeing a deer in northern Fort Collins, right? Look at where you live. You're the lost stronghold for biodiversity, people. It's amazing. It's amazing what we see.
What are other challenges that you hear? Frequently asked questions to the Albany County Conservancy, Ann. Your top 3. That's obviously one. Is the wildlife will adjust. They'll move. They'll be okay.
No, because I'm hearing things like super herding. So people are sending me things. People send me messages, and they'll show me all the elk super herded because they don't like the wind turbines, so they don't move around them. They just kind of stay together in a big group, and that's not healthy for them, right? And you see it with the pronghorn now on
So their free
Highway
movement,
287. It's
their free
kind of wonky.
movement
Is
makes them
limited.
makes them a healthier animal, and that's being infringed on by that migration pattern.
Yeah, and I go back to when I
obstructed.
was a kid. When I was a kid, tourists who came to Frontier Days would just bask in the fact they'd seen a deer. They didn't see a deer, they saw a pronghorn.
Right.
Because there were thousands of pronghorn between Cheyenne and Laramie. Literally, you saw them everywhere.
We used to see herds, as you say that. I recall just between Cheyenne and Laramie, herds of
You're
antelope.
not going to see that
Herds of
anymore.
antelope. You
They
don't see
don't
that
like
anymore.
that wind project that got mandated $8 million for killing eagles because it couldn't even apply for the license to kill
Come on,
eagles.
you can buy eagles. How much is an eagle?
Well, so
Just buy
an
more.
eagle take, I think they pay like $35,000 to initiate that paperwork with the federal government.
What's a human life worth?
Oh my gosh.
What's the value of that osprey eagle in Fremont County at Half Moon Lake? You know, what is that nest, full or empty, worth?
Well, so eagles, that's a really sad topic. So Wyoming has the highest concentration of eagles in the United States. I've been grilled about that. I've had people research that, and that's a safe comment to make on the radio today. It's true. We're very close. We're neck and neck with Montana, but we have an area that is very productive for breeding. And guess what? That area has all those wind projects. Rocky Mountain Power is very familiar with that area. And guess what we're not seeing anymore? So notice after notice, we're not getting, maybe we're not getting that step of due process to make public comment if public comment is taken in earnest. Well, and it gets to, people tell me who worked as biologists, when you're talking about these federal employees losing their jobs, right? That it was their dream job, that they loved doing it. And being out in the field, I go back to the glory days, which I was just a kid, but that would have been in the 70s, right? How those agencies really, really did their job well, and they really cared. What's transpired? The fact that you can pay to kill eagles. The fact, it's been going on administration after administration, right? Because politicians, are they biologists? Do they live in Wyoming?
Today is
Some of them do, but so it gets to now, the due process hasn't been done right. Like, things are missing all the time. We may have overlooked or misplaced that report.
Tricks are played, aren't they?
I don't even know if you could call it that, because I just told a reporter yesterday from New York that I feel it's a surreal environment. If somebody manipulates and tells falsehoods, and it's more than one, you tend to question, just reality. But that's where you have to have your compass. That's where a small community like Wyoming, you can make a huge difference, because you know what, folks, you still have a compass. Because you know better, because you can observe, and you're right in the middle of this. And that helps me a lot, as some agency will tell me something, and I'm like, no. First of all, the way you said it is weird. Secondly, that's just, no, I don't buy into that, and then come to find out, no, that's just not an answer. That's not suitable. Right? And so you can move forward. It's not questioning, right? Because it's multiple individuals, right? Which gets to, sometimes it's easier to check the box and get it off your desk, right?
Today we find ourselves 2025. The Trump administration is administrating across various areas of our government. What impact has the Trump administration had thus far on concerns or issues that the Albany County Conservancy is following?
Well, I think for the American public, an individual said to me, because I presented on Rail Tie Wind to a bunch of folks back east, right? And the introduction was, never in the history of the United States have we had a president declare so many executive orders, starting with one specifically focused on energy in the history of the U.S. So there's an executive order where our president strongly said that he was going to halt all offshore and onshore wind. That's why it's fascinating to me that a couple weeks ago I got a notification for yet another wind project that is owned by a company in the Netherlands, right? Why are my federal taxpayer dollars, I'm just talking about me individually, right, all of us, why is that paying for that? Because our president told us there'd be no permitting. So why are we doing an environmental assessment?
What's Governor Gordon?
And they're not assessing anything. These things have been so streamlined, they copy and paste from other applications.
What's Governor Gordon's administration done with respect to Wyoming in his final 2 years of his governorship? What has his impact been in Wyoming on matters concerning the Albany County Conservancy?
I think the conversation would go back prior to that, but you have to remember he's your governor, so he has to work with state government. So he can't go rogue. I mean, he does. He vetoes things during the legislature, but you also hear about it, right? You hear the press comment on it, and you hear people can. I mean, we have a system of checks and balances, right? It's not just always exerting power over someone. So, and that's a shift for me. 5 years ago, when I became aware of Rail Tie Wind, I showed up at the first State Land Commission meeting where they were saying, should we lease our state land, public land, to connect Jen? And hundreds of people zoomed in, right? So, and they were not in favor. You read the press and they always want to show both sides of the story. So they talked about a lot of people showed up who were in support of renewable energy. We sat there for, a 6 to 8 hour day. And I can tell you, I was keeping tally and everybody was opposed, right? Except for maybe two that honestly, I question whether one of them was paid to be there. Right? Because if you're a leasee, I think you're pretty much paid to be there. If you're not pro-renewable, why just sign a piece of paper, right? So that day, the State Land Board voted down to lease. So I remember my kids and my husband patted me on the back, right? Because I was the nutty mom who sat at the computer all day just so I could raise my Zoom hand and make my comments. Right? So, and I remember hesitating because my husband said, it's all over then, right? You won. Really? So then I remember 6 months later, because I am just paranoid by nature, I have a dry sense of humor. I'm a Wyomingite. What can I tell you? So, and my mom always said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Right? So I remember getting an email from a citizen group in Albany County because they were reaching out to other groups. So you ask, do nonprofits work together? Well, we don't have a lot of habitat, history, and wildlife nonprofits in Albany County. So this group of concerned citizens who live south of town reached out to me. And in particular, their attorney sent me an email he got from the state. And it said, that's going to be on the agenda in the January meeting. So in other words, they're going to vote again. And then that attorney did their due diligence and talked to the state and found out, is this true? Because it's not on the agenda. And then again, there was like 6 hours of contentious people on Zoom saying, we don't want this. And then the only land board member who voted it down was our treasurer, because he knew it was financially shameful, because somebody really smart called in and pointed out the bad economics, right? So the state land board checked the box. Getting to your governor can't exude power over the whole land board, industrial siting, right? That's why I was at the Public Service Commission. In fact, you have all these different groups that are tasked with doing all these different things, and they've never actually evolved to where they need to be. And I can truly say that because I have a cousin who gave me a book called The Paradox of Plenty. And it was written by Governor Friedenthal. And if you would read that 200-page book, folks, it's an eye-opener, because it talks about we wanted an industrial siting council because we were going to build this huge coal slurry, right? Only problem with Wyoming is what? Do we have a lot of water? No. So there was a lot of fear what was going to leach into our water, like the water that our cattle drink, that we drink, right? So people agreed to meet in the middle. Everybody did, because we were going to have an industrial siting council. But the joke is, like, they've never denied anything. They've never evolved. So get involved. People always, that's their intro to me. Oh, I've heard about industrial siting. They approve everything. Well, maybe you should tell them why they shouldn't approve everything.
We're visiting with Anne Brande, Executive Director for the Albany County Conservancy, and we'll be back in a moment after this.